For a long time, bites from the venomous habu snake were a serious issue in parts of Japan, deeply affecting people's lives. In 1980 alone, around 400 people were bitten, and some cases proved fatal. Although Japan is home to several venomous snakes, the greatest threat came from the largest species, the habu and their relatives, the eastern pit vipers. These snakes are part of the same family as rattlesnakes and puff adders, with coral snakes and cobras as their distant cousins, giving you an idea of the danger Japanese locals faced. The problem was made worse because for years there were no antidote available, and even after one was developed, it had to be stored in liquid form, making it nearly impossible to keep in rural areas without electricity or proper storage. Ironically, these rural regions were exactly where most bites occurred, and building infrastructure that was costly and slow. Eventually, Japan decided on what seemed like a brilliant solution: introduce an animal that eats snakes and is immune to their venom. In 1979, about 30 small Indian mongooses were brought to Amami Oshima Island to control not only habu snakes, but also rats. Since mongooses are naturally found in places like India, Nepal, and Pakistan, the idea seemed promising at first. By 1993, however, their impact became impossible to ignore. The mongoose population exploded, reaching nearly 10,000 by the year 2000, and the Ministry of the Environment raised the alarm. Strangely enough, while the snake population did drop, mongooses weren't responsible at all. Despite being agile, fast, and naturally resistant to cobra venom, mongooses showed little interest in hunting the habu. One major problem was that mongooses are active during the day, while the habu is nocturnal, so they rarely cross paths. But even if they had, mongooses preferred easier prey like mice and rabbits rather than the difficult and dangerous task of catching snakes. In other words, the perfect solution turned out to be anything but leaving Japan with a new problem: an invasive mongoose population that the local wildlife was not prepared to handle. In the end, the mongoose turned out to be completely useless for the job they were brought in for, but very successful at breeding. By 2000, the Japanese government had to launch an active program to reduce their growing population, and since then around 32,000 mongooses were captured. The last recorded capture happened in April 2018, and with no new cases reported in the 6 years since, experts concluded that the invasive species had been completely eradicated from Amami Oshima Island. Japan's Ministry of the Environment officially declared the program a success, and while everyone celebrated, except perhaps the mongooses themselves, it had been a long and bumpy road. Early efforts relied on setting simple traps along roads, but these had little effect. It soon became clear that only a comprehensive strategy would work. Authorities introduced specially designed traps, toxic baits, and attractants, while also employing monitoring techniques and even search dogs. To ensure precision, the traps were built specifically for mongooses, with shapes and sizes that prevented other animals from being caught. Local residents also joined the effort. Since 2005, squads of mongoose hunters patrol the forests and mountains, dedicating countless hours, resources, and funding to the eradication campaign. Some might wonder why Japan went to such lengths. After all, couldn't the mongooses have just been left alone? The answer lies in the devastating impact they had on Amami Oshima's fragile ecosystem. Instead of controlling snake populations as intended, the mongooses began hunting endemic species, including the endangered Amami rabbit, an ancient living fossil, now found only on Amami Oshima and one other island. Their numbers declined sharply due to predation. The mongooses also preyed on ryukyu rats and at least 15 other native species, pushing some toward extinction. Beyond wildlife, the farming sector suffered as well. Mongooses raided poultry, devoured fruit crops, and even spread diseases. Within just 20 years, the habitats of some small animals had shrunk by nearly 40%. What began as a well-meaning solution to the habu snake problem ended up as a destructive ecological mistake, proving once again how fragile island ecosystems can be. Ecosystems with local species that have never lived alongside predators often struggle to adapt, as native animals simply don't know how to defend themselves. While the arrival of a new predator is damaging anywhere in the world, it is especially devastating on islands, and even more so when the predator is a mongoose. Mongooses will eat just about anything they can catch, making them particularly destructive. It took nearly 25 years to eliminate them from Amami Oshima and close to half a century to fully conclude the project. Although the mass extermination of mongooses may sound cruel, from the standpoint of protecting endangered native wildlife, Japan's approach was necessary and highly effective. Invasive species must be contained quickly before they spread, because once established, eradication can become nearly impossible. Japan succeeded within this narrow window of opportunity, making Amami Oshima the only large island in the world where mongoose eradication was fully achieved. Globally, there have been just 9 successful cases of mongoose removal, but none on an island of this scale. By 2020, snake bites, the original reason mongooses were introduced, had dropped to around 60 cases per year. However, this decline was not due to the mongooses, but rather to human safety measures and better access to antidotes. In fact, since 1992, there hasn't been a single recorded death from a habu snake bite. Despite the success on Amami Oshima, mongooses remain on other Japanese islands, meaning the battle is far from over. The strategies and lessons learned are now being applied elsewhere, particularly in northern Okinawa, where invasive mongooses pose a serious risk of spreading back to Amami Oshima. Introduced to Okinawa during the Meiji era, some 70 years earlier than on Amami Oshima, just 17 mongooses were released, but the island's warm climate and proximity to their native range allowed them to thrive. While their population is somewhat controlled in northern Okinawa, they still persist in central and southern regions. Specially designed fences, short but built with an L shape at the base to prevent digging, have proven effective in limiting their spread, as mongooses rarely climb over barriers. Much like on Amami Oshima, the survival of Okinawa's endemic species, including 3 rare bird species, now depends on containing the mongoose population. You're right. Japan isn't the first country to turn to biological control, a term used when people introduce one species to combat another. In fact, there's an entire field of science dedicated to it. Normally, this process involves extensive research. Scientists first identify the pest and its natural predator, then conduct further studies to determine whether the predator might negatively affect the local ecosystem. Only after such precautions are predators usually introduced, and in many cases, this has worked well. One of the most successful and common examples is farmers using predatory insects to protect fruit trees and gardens. However, the case of the mongoose was quite different. The small Asian mongoose was introduced to countries like Cuba, Croatia, Jamaica, Haiti, Puerto Rico, the Lesser Antilles, Honduras, Panama, and others. And while results varied, some of these introductions initially seemed successful, but things went wrong in Hawaii. In the 1800s, sugarcane was Hawaii's most valuable commodity, and one of the biggest threats to plantations was rats, which chewed through the sweet cane stalks and caused massive losses. In 1872, Hawaiian planters, inspired by reports of success from Caribbean sugar producers, decided to replicate the idea of bringing in mongooses from India. In the 1880s, 72 mongooses were imported from Jamaica to the Big Island, and their offspring were soon spread to Maui, Molokai, and Oahu. Some skeptics on the Big Island argued that more research should have been done before importing the animals, but they were ignored. The critical mistake soon became clear. Rats are nocturnal and active at night, while mongooses are diurnal and active during the day. This meant the two species rarely even encountered each other, and instead of controlling rats, the mongooses devastated Hawaii's native species. Ground-nesting birds, turtles, and other small animals were left vulnerable, as their eggs became easy prey for the predators. Over time, the damage grew severe. Numerous bird and turtle species face extinction, with at least 8 native Hawaiian bird species wiped out, many of which are now listed as federally endangered. Efforts to mitigate the disaster included installing barriers to keep mongooses out of protected areas. But unlike Japan, Hawaii had missed its critical window for eradication. Controlling mongoose populations is now nearly impossible, and they remain a permanent and destructive part of the island's ecosystem. Interestingly, the Hawaiian government does not even classify the mongoose introduction as biological control, Since the animals were never properly assessed before being released, a cautionary tale of what happens when invasive species are introduced without careful research. Hawaii, in fact, got off relatively easy compared to Jamaica. After a British colonist introduced mongooses to a Jamaican sugar plantation in 1872 to control rats, the plan backfired. The mongooses did not eat the rats as expected, but instead spread across Jamaica, devastating populations of local birds and reptiles. With fewer natural predators left to keep insect and arthropod populations in check, a severe tick outbreak followed. While colonists complained, British authorities dismissed the issue, insisting that the ticks were simply attacking the mongooses and that nature's balance would restore itself, an assumption that proved false. The same destructive pattern played out elsewhere, on 4 small Caribbean islands. For instance, the St. Croix ground lizard population was nearly wiped out by mongooses and habitat loss. On its namesake island, these lizards vanished entirely. Fortunately, conservationists intervened, relocating surviving lizards from 2 neighboring islands and boosting their numbers from just 400 to nearly 3,000. Today, scientists are not only working to protect the species from extinction, but also striving to reintroduce them to their original home. The mongoose has a long and complicated history with humans. A fascinating discovery in Egypt revealed a 4,000-year-old tomb painting showing a mongoose on a leash, the only known depiction of its kind in Egyptian art. Although mongooses have never been fully domesticated through controlled breeding, some cultures kept them as pets or working animals, mainly to combat pests like snakes, rats, and mice. Scholars even suggest the Egyptian mongoose may have been trained to scare away birds, making hunting easier. Intriguingly, the same tomb also shows another leashed animal, possibly a dog, or perhaps a goat without horns, adding to the mystery. In modern times, there have even been attempts to train mongooses for entirely new purposes. In Sri Lanka, where locals have long relied on them to chase cobras from farms, officials once proposed using mongooses to detect illegal substances. A grant of $50,000 was secured, a specialist was hired, and the National Zoo offered its grounds for training. The plan was simple: release mongooses into cargo containers filled with car parts, and if they discovered contraband, they would signal by emerging with bristling tails. Surprisingly, the animals performed well in tests, proving they could be trained. Enthusiasm was high, but political changes and upheavals halted the project before it could take off. The idea was abandoned, leaving many to wonder what might have been, perhaps even imagining a sequel to Zootopia starring mongoose police officers.